Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to Always Out Front. Our guests today are Jay Kaplan from the Michigan ACLU LGBTQ and HIV Project, a staff attorney, former Representative Jon Hoadley, and now with, I forget, Michigan
Civic Action Fund.
Michigan Civic Action Fund. We'd like to have a discussion about what we can expect with the Biden administration coming in here in just a few days. I'm going to sort of gloss over all of the violence and issues like that, and keep this conversation forward looking, because there's so much now that is possible with a new administration coming in and holding the majority in the Senate. And there's a lot on our table, a lot that was broken over the last few years, where we had made some progress and still needed to make more progress, but a lot of what we did get accomplished got broken again. So I'd kind of like to start off, I think, with Jay, and if maybe Jay, you can tell us about some of the administrative stuff, particularly that are needed so terribly badly by the LGBTQ community.
Sure. Well, I was making a list prior to our discussion, and there's just a number of executive orders and policies and rules from the Trump administration that the Biden administration needs to rescind and needs to change. And on top of that list is the transgender military ban, where the President Trump reinstated this ban through a tweet several years ago. There's the rule regarding the Affordable Care Act, Section 1557. The new rule from the Trump administration said that LGBT people were not protected against discrimination in accessing health insurance and health insurance coverage. There's the HUD shelter rule that would allow federally subsidized homeless shelters to be able to turn away transgender women based on their gender identity. There's the medical conscience rule that would allow medical providers to refuse to provide healthcare services when they cite religious and moral beliefs. There is a rule regarding federal grants that would allow programs to discriminate against different groups of people when they cite particular religious beliefs for doing so. There's a recent Department of Education interpretation of Title IX, which just came out last week, where the administration says that Title IX, the definition of, which prohibits sex discrimination in education, that would not encompass sexual orientation and gender identity. So that's not even the complete list of right. Rules and interpretations of things that need to be changed. The other thing I think with the Biden administration, certainly the Attorney General and the Solicitor General in the Biden administration will have a much different interpretation than the Trump administration, where they argued unsuccessfully before the United States Supreme Court that civil rights laws that prohibit sex discrimination do not cover right. LGBT people. I think we'll see a totally different position from the Biden administration on that.
Mm-hmm. So there's smaller things that maybe have gone unnoticed by the larger community, like the Department of Education stopping OCR enforcement of yes. LGBT students' claims yep. about discrimination, things like that. So there's a lot on the line here that needs to be fixed and can get fixed administratively. Legislatively, and Jon, you can weigh in on this one too. Where do you think we have some legislative opportunities now with both houses of Congress and the executive branch?
Well, I think the first thing is for folks to remember that having the gavel, meaning to be the party in the majority, is so critical because with very few exceptions, the majority leader gets to set the agenda. Right? It doesn't mean that everything is going to pass, which is why it's really incumbent upon us as advocates and grassroots supporters to stay engaged, because just because you can get it on the agenda doesn't mean it will. However, with the way that the maps currently are looking, with with the fact that now that there is at least a gavel available in every chamber, there's some big things that we could be passing. Whether, of course, we're talking about the Equality Act, whether we're talking about some other significant structural changes that impact LGBT folks, such as labor protections for people in the workplace, such as environmental protections, which we know that because of the impacts of environmental racism, the clustering of impacts based on people, and of course, where LGBT people also experience similar significant levels of poverty or lack of access to resources in many cases. Like these ancillary pieces come together, and I do think there are some opportunities here that we could move. The other big one that I think legislatively that I want everybody to keep on their radar is we are going to see some sort of action on healthcare in the next 2 years. Now, what that looks like is going to be really different, but we also know, because healthcare is complicated and healthcare is confusing sometimes, that LGBTQ folks have some unique healthcare needs. So making sure that our lives are reflected in whatever the policy that moves us a step towards universal healthcare, whatever that looks like, it's going to be really critical that we're involved.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important that we are counted. We're counted in studies, we're counted in the census, we're counted in surveys. Oh, absolutely.
Amy, I was also going to mention, I believe there's going to be an effort administratively to try to get a uniform in terms of federal documents regarding changing gender markers. I think there's going to be an effort to try to have a policy that would not require people to have letters from doctors or from various medical professionals, but allow people under an affidavit, under oath, to be able to to maintain what their gender is on federal documents. I know that's going to be a big advocacy effort with this administration.
That is terrific. If we can get a blanket policy in all the states that covers gender marker changing, both on birth certificates and other ID documents that we use every day, like driver's licenses or state ID cards, because right now it's a real patchwork. Some states you can't change your gender marker on your birth certificate at all. Other states, like Michigan, has a pretty high bar, requires some pretty invasive surgical remedies, and
right now those would have to be done unfortunately done at the state level. But any federal ID documents like Social Security cards, anything related to that. That would be the uniform policy effort. But we still have to work in Michigan, and I know legislation certainly has been introduced that would eliminate the surgery requirement on the gender marker change on the birth certificate.
So picking up on what Jay was saying, though, there's some opportunities here too, where having just a different set of expectations in the way that we see and treat LGBTQ folks, it has areas where it's going to cross into both administrative policy and legislative policy. Well, immigration is a great example of this. Thinking about the ways that we view LGBT families who are crossing borders, who are seeking asylum, who are seeking refugee status, both has part of a world that lives in an administrative section. Everything from administrative courts to just the way that we interpret those statutes, to the fact that we could be moving towards some sort of broader, comprehensive immigration reform. Now, how comprehensive or how big is it? Of course, a big question. Right. But those are the types of places then where we're finally going to have an administration that recognizes the dignity and the worth of LGBTQ people and our families. And that's going to be a sea change in some very visible pieces, but also just things that a lot of times people don't even realize were a problem until they run headlong into it.
Right, correct. And just having the example, the cultural norm exemplified in an administrative rule federally makes it easier for I think to make the argument at the state level.
Oh, sure, sure. Yeah, no, absolutely right. What happens at the federal level can have a significant influence on the state. And the other thing, Amy, in terms of the president's ability to nominate judges to the federal bench, Donald Trump was able to appoint more judges on the federal bench in his first, in his first and only term than really any other president in history. And we know that many of these were very conservative judges, but even more so, a majority of them had issued decisions that were unfavorable to the cause of LGBT rights. And now President Biden will have an opportunity, probably not, it might be still difficult to nominate real progressive judges, but certainly much more moderate judges than have been put on the bench by President Trump. And that could make a difference, because the way we view LGBT rights, and I think a lot of national groups, as a result of the change on the federal courts, is we don't see that so much as an option anymore because of the many unfriendly courts, and we're going to have to rely more on our state courts. And we're fortunate in Michigan that for the first time in 2 decades, we have an opportunity, to maybe get some successful determinations from our highest state court.
Right, with our highest state court having a liberal majority, and the Chief Justice being a Democrat. Chief Justice McCormack.
Right. And as John mentioned too, I think the other thing we have to remember too, in Michigan, we're fortunate to have a governor's office, an attorney general's office, and a secretary of state's office that has been supportive of LGBT rights. And we've been able to make some differences. So our insurance regulatory agency, Department of Insurance and Financial Services, they issued a bulletin this summer making it clear that insurance companies cannot single out transgender people for discriminatory treatment regarding coverage of insurance coverage, as well as covering medically necessary procedures. We also, Michigan's Medicaid came out with a policy about a year ago, also making it clear that gender identity was a protected category. And we've made progress, as you know, Amy, with the Secretary of State's office regarding the gender marker change policy. And we want to go back to them this year and make sure they offer a third option for non-binary individuals.
Right. Yeah, I was part of all 3 of those things.
Absolutely.
And so, and it's made a tremendous difference in a lot of lives.
And, one point I just want to pick up here, when we think about then, the examples you gave literally are deliverables that are changing people's lives.
Right.
And, some people say, well, how big are they? Did they impact me? And those are all questions people can ask. But I think one of the takeaways is that if we get to lift something up as a suggestion to the Biden administration, it's act, deliver. And whether we're talking about historic changes, we need to pass the Equality Act. He made a promise, we need to get it done. But in addition to that, let's also figure out all of the other ways where we can make action. And I think one thing for folks who are listening to the podcast to think about is, in the first 100 days, we set these expectations, like, what are you going to get done in the first 100 days? There might be a whole list of things, and you might not hear your one particular issue. But I think one thing that's more critical for us to be thinking about is not the exact which particular boxes were checked, but how many boxes got checked, period. And I think if there's one thing that I've really learned serving previously in the legislature, it's that ultimately people are looking for results, and people voted for change, and they want to see that reflected in their lives, big and small. So, we have an obligation as advocates for LGBTQ equality to push for the best policies we can. And I also think it's incumbent upon the Biden administration to deliver a diverse and robust array of results as fast as possible.
Right, exactly. And those things that affect the quality of daily life for people are often the most impactful, and are the ones that give politicians a second term, frankly.
And John, you're so right. I mean, I just noticed when Governor Whitmer took office, For the first time, phone calls and emails got returned when we wanted to discuss various issues. You're able to have a conversation. You're able to get your foot in the door. You might not always, accomplish what you want right away, but at least there's the accessibility. And I think we will also find that probably with the Biden administration too. They're at least open and they're willing to sit down and talk and to engage. And that makes a huge difference.
Makes a humongous difference. Yeah, we were able I was able to have a casual friends conversation with our Secretary of State, which then led to a personal meeting with her and the Department of State's Policy Council, which ultimately led to changing our driver's license requirements.
In those types of ways that your personal story, your personal relationships can impact public policy at the state and federal level are only going to become more apparent. In Michigan, we have nonpartisan redistricting that's occurring, which means that it's going to be a jump ball come the November 2022 elections for both the state Senate and the state House, with new lines that are hopefully more fair. Because it's hard to do worse since we have one of the most gerrymandered maps in the country. And so, the conversation, the relationships you're building here you could be talking to the next state senator in your area or a new member of Congress. And at the federal level, I think about what the maps look like, particularly for the US Senate coming into 22. And, in addition to having to protect some key wins, right? The Arizona special, Mark Kelly, Senator Warnock and Georgia, there's going to be a lot of open opportunities where incumbents who are not running, the senators from Pennsylvania and North Carolina, they might be interested in hearing more of our stories because they have already made a decision they are not running for re-election. There's other states that, our neighbors like Wisconsin are going to have a very contentious toss-up US Senate election. And, when you start mining your contact book, you might think about people you already know in Wisconsin. So I'm just saying, Florida's in the same boat too. Marco Rubio is going to be up. So lots of opportunities where our personal stories, our personal relationships could have a big impact on our state and our country.
Yeah. And we've seen the progress that we've made so much, in terms of court cases with the United States Supreme Court were a result of people's stories and changing hearts and minds. And I think the biggest challenge for LGBT rights is the attempts to use religion to justify discrimination or to exempt from complying with laws. And we're going to have that discussion. And I think one of the best ways we can have that discussion is to share our stories and to talk about how policies like the Trump administration was promulgating, how they really can negatively impact our lives.
Right, exactly.
This is also picking up what Jay was saying. This is why it's important for LGBTQ folks to stay involved and aware of broadly what's happening politically, right? Because our lives aren't singular. And we all know that. We all have different facets to our lives. But the other piece is, as we look at some of the political rhetoric that might be coming out around other issues, for example, vaccination issues and public health issues moving forward, we have to be very careful that people aren't trying to sneak in bad precedents in one part of administrative rules or laws that are being passed at, say, the state level to try to then set a precedent to create additional exemptions on other issues. And so you have to stay engaged, even if you think, look, I'm going to get the vaccine for COVID-19. I'm not worried about it. Why do I care? Because they might be setting a booby trap that could then be hurting us later when we're trying to get something good done.
Yeah.
Correct. And I think around the religious objection issues is probably my biggest fear. Having that sneak into becoming precedent in a number of areas can be so injurious to our progress later on. The First Amendment is really very clear. It doesn't take a constitutional scholar to know that it's not just a separation of church and state, the Establishment Clause. It means that I have a right to not be impacted adversely by your religion. So, you don't get to force yours down my throat. I don't get to force mine down your throat. So,
Yeah, the idea of using religion as a sword.
swords.
And yeah, and John, to your point, sometimes when we get an administration that is favorable or supportive of our community, there's a tendency to become complacent. And, we find that with during the Obama administration, membership in the ACLU declined somewhat, just because people thought, well, things are going well. And then when the Trump administration came in, everybody's saying, what can we do? What can we do to help? And I think it's up to all of us, as in the community, to keep people informed. And we have some opportunities, but we want to make sure we take advantage of those opportunities, and that all of us are engaged, because there's a lot at stake.
And as a reminder too, I've having sat in those chairs before, for a lot of us, we think, on the outside, we think, well, that's a no-brainer. And it's important to remember that even for folks who agree with us, who share our values, it never hurts for them to hear that they did the right thing, or encourage them to do the right thing. And that can be a friendly conversation, right? Talking to a lawmaker doesn't need to be a hostile interaction.
Right,
And,
exactly.
and when they do, it's amazing, right? Because there will be the folks on Twitter who are happy to hate you. They're the folks on Facebook that'll flood your comments and tell you all the reasons why what you did was wrong. And a lot of times it's because our supporters think, I didn't even need to say thank you because I assumed you were going to do the right thing. So good reminder from Jay that don't get complacent, right? Both with our the folks who got to hold accountable for their bad votes, but also our friends, because that accountability could also mean saying thank you for doing the right thing.
Right, and developing a relationship with your legislators and their staff is critically important. I know in my time spent as a lobbyist, I interacted with legislators that I never dreamed of even being able to have a civil conversation with. And the next thing I know, we're having lunch. And, maybe I'm not going to get the vote out of that person that I want, but at least they know who a trans person is now. And some of them I've maintained friendships with, some people that you wouldn't have thought I would ever find common ground with. So it's critically important that we do this with friendly legislators too. Make sure that we give them, let them know we're here, and that what's on our agenda, where we have common ground, and how we can, how we can help them move the issue.
Yeah.
So.
And I like what you said, Amy, too, about trying to forge a relationship or conversations, even with legislators who would be likely to oppose. Because like you said, I remember, John, when I first started 20 years ago, there were legislators in Michigan. I don't have any gay people in my district. And certainly people who are transgender, nobody in my district. Right. Of course, that's not true. But when they meet someone who's a member of the community and they see that that this person has a real life, and I think that's part of the learning curve.
So what's the bottom line here? Is it about it's forming in my mind that it's really about staying engaged and staying on top of politics in general and politics of our own interest groups, but also how our politics can readily and favorably impact the politics of another interest group. So maybe it's also about forming allyships on the ground, forming coalitions that have adjacent interests and can help lift up one another.
I think that's right. And if I'm in a bottom line, I think we live in a democratic republic, right? Which means that the idea here is that we elect folks who are going to make a lot of decisions, but there's still this incumbency upon us to make sure that we're staying engaged in the process. So, make sure that you're staying aware. It doesn't have, for a lot of us, it's not going to be our full-time job to be on top of folks, but it's our duty to make sure that we're figuring out, so what is happening in our state capital? What is happening in DC? how can we make sure that we are interacting with folks who are supposed to be representing our interests and our values? And then the last thing I would say here, if I'm bottom lining it from my perspective, is this is also why it's so important that we're supporting organizations that share our values, right? If you haven't renewed your ACLU of Michigan membership, you probably should. You know, it's never too late to sign up to be a monthly supporter of OutFront, right? Those are the kind of groups that are being in the intermediary. So you don't have to check in every single day because you know someone else is doing some work. And then you got to pay attention to those organizations when they say, hey, we need you to take some action now.
Right.
Yeah.
Jay, do you have a bottom line?
Well, I think, kind of with both of what you were saying, it's a reminder that there's a great deal of intersectionality in our community. And so, as Jon mentioned, issues involving immigration and issues involving access to healthcare, among other things, certainly impact our community. And I think, as part of this conversation with our community members, we need to talk about what is possible and how do we get to where we want to get. If we want a state civil rights law that explicitly mentions sexual orientation and gender identity, what does that take? And how will we get there? I think when you explain to people what the roadmap is and what needs to happen, I think there's a great buy-in, and also people's willingness to be involved with this effort too.
So I think to cap that off, to sort of sum up here real quick, what I'd like to say is an amalgam of what you both have said. Stay engaged, pay attention to the organizations that are out there specifically paying attention to the minutia so that you don't have to, but who will raise the flag when your voice is needed. And that I think I want to interject a little note of caution also, that even though we will have a unified federal government, if we push too hard, too fast, even the most well-meaning legislators will balk, because they have a different perspective from what we may have. Whereas the shelter rule is particularly important, I think, to me. That may not be at the top of the priorities list for the rest of the legislature. So I think strategically planning along with the administration, the things that can be done are the things that we should be doing and working alongside them. So I want to thank you both for coming on with me today. It's always such a great pleasure to talk to either of you, but to have both of you on the same podcast is just amazing. So I want to thank you again, Jay from the ACLU of Michigan, and Jon, I'm sorry, I forgot again, Michigan Civic Action.
It's fine. The Michigan Civic Action Fund, but I'm excited to share my experience as a former state rep.
So thank you so very much. And this has been always Out Front, and we'll see you again in another month or so.